the genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. There isn't infertility and this is the solution, because if it was, guess what? IVF wouldn't fail 70% of the time. It's the exposome. It's all of the things that are related to and that we are surrounded by. It's the environment that we swim in, from the foods that we eat, to the things that products that we put on our skin, to what we wash our hair with, to, you name it. A diet that is high in processed and ultra processed foods is going to negatively impact health on many different kinds of parameters. It will have a cardiometabolic impact, that it will have a fertility impact, it will have a mental health impact. So, those foods, processed foods and ultra processed foods, of course, are going to make, a big difference in the status of health of the individual.
Gabriela Rosa, hello, how are you?
Very well. Thank you for having me, Rafa.
Thank you for being here. So, Gabriela, I don't usually try to do the intros to the guests anymore because I found that I'm really not very good at it. But I actually thought of a better idea. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we can get the conversation started from there. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I
Awesome.
love it when we know our strengths. And
And especially our weaknesses.
very good. Well, look, I'm Gabriela Rosa. I'm a fertility specialist. And for the last 2 decades, actually, since 2001, I've been helping couples overcome infertility and recurrent miscarriage, even when other treatments have failed. And throughout my journey, I was trained originally as a naturopathic doctor. I did a master's in public health at Harvard. I'm currently doing my doctorate there. And I also have a master's of science in reproductive medicine and human genetics. So that's kind of in a nutshell my background. I guess, where I serve most is in that kind of window where couples feel like they really want to be starting a family or completing their family, and they have found struggles along the way. So that's really where I play most of my day.
Beautiful. And I love how you just glanced over the fact that you graduated from Harvard, by the way, um, which really says something about your humility, which I love. So Gabriela, tell us a little bit. So you've been working this for a long time. What are some of the things that you see coming up a lot when it comes down to fertility or lack thereof?
Mm, it's fascinating because I think a lot of times we just expect to believe what we were taught in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us, depending on your age group, I don't know what they're teaching in high school these days. In fact, I have to go to my 12-year-old son to find out. But basically, I remember being taught, and I know that I've spoken to many people who were taught the same, which is you have sex, first of all, having children will destroy your life. It's, the one thing that you absolutely should not do.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to ruin your life opportunities, and it's going to be a thing that's going to be terrible. Now, you with 3 children should tell us a little bit more about whether that's true or not.
Uh-huh.
But look, the reality of it is that, a lot of people were taught that, and a lot of us have also been taught that all that it takes is you being, not careful or having sex one time and you're going to get pregnant. As
Mm.
girls, that was the messaging throughout not only my entire growing up, but even, like still a lot of what women hear. And so guys are kind of fed this secondary piece of information, which is like, if you make a girl pregnant, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So, there's a lot of that societal
True.
conception that goes on, and for, no pun intended, but there's a lot of that goes on in terms of the conversations that we have around our dinner tables and in schools and so on and so forth. So most people expect that that's exactly what's going to happen when they start trying to have a baby, that they're going to have sex one time and they're going to be pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And so often what people don't realize is that even though that is what happens for most people out there, the majority of the population, especially at peak fertility, which is around that kind of, 20 to 30 years of age, they're going to be pregnant within 3 attempts, right? So it's literally most couples at peak fertility will have sex, get pregnant, have a baby, done. We're no longer having this conversation. When we're still having this conversation, then we need to start really understanding, but okay, what is going on and why is that happening? Because typically there will be something or some things, and often it's many things that are getting in the way there. So I think the misconceptions that people have begin much early on, and really around the time of 18 and beyond, where people have a very different idea about what fertility actually is. The other thing that I see very frequently is that fertility is made out to be a female thing. It's made to be a woman's issue. And even now, in kind of like, day-to-day healthcare, when a couple might go to see a doctor, the focus is going to be very much on the female. Where if you really think about it, 50% of the DNA that's going to make that baby actually comes from the male. I like to say that fertility is a team sport.
Mm.
And the reason why I say that is because if you think about it, and I know, Raphael, it's probably going to feel very strange if I say to you, just imagine if you were pregnant right now, right?
God.
Like, oh, that's a bit weird.
Mm-hmm.
But like, indulge me for a moment, right? Like, if you could be pregnant
Mm-hmm.
and you were pregnant right now, well, how would you think differently? For a lot of people, and I know that if I ask this question to a female, they're immediately going to say, well, I would stop doing all of these things and I would start doing all of these things because I want to make sure that my baby is as healthy as possible. The truth and the reality is that men need to think about it that way too,
Mm-hmm.
because what happens is that right now within you, you already have 50% of that little baby that you want to create. All of the cells that are going to be making the healthy sperm that is going to be able to actually affect a pregnancy is within you right now. Right. And if we're not optimizing all of that environment and your health and your biochemistry, the sperm component is going to be less effective and less healthy, and therefore more prone to creating a greater risk pregnancy or inability to conceive, right? So a lot of people don't realize that it is because of the sperm that 50% of miscarriages occur. It is because of sperm that 50% of women can't get pregnant, and not just because of the egg, not just because of the environment in which that embryo is developing. So I think that, for men to understand, and I think for couples to understand that this really is something that they're doing together, and that there are responsibilities and benefits on both sides, and that there are things that even if the doctor says, oh, don't worry, your sperm is fine, but if your partner isn't conceiving, that is not necessarily true. One thing that I hear very often, and this is a big bugbear of mine, is when couples come to me, they've been infertile for years. And in fact, we did a study as part of my MPH at Harvard. We actually studied our results and the types of patients that we served and the types of patients that got the best results through the program. And what I saw was really interesting. The average number of years that couples were infertile coming to us was 4 years.
Oh, wow.
Almost 50% of those couples had experienced failed IVF treatments. And before coming to us, 51.5% had experienced miscarriage. So there were serious issues that were going on there. Now, for most of those couples, what they were told, because I do all of the initial assessments, so I get to speak to all of our patients. And, the vast majority of our patients had been told everything is normal, just keep trying. Now imagine a time and a place where you've been infertile for 4 years. Doctors have done, some tests, And basically, because everything was within the reference range of the tests that they did, they simply are told, well, everything is normal, just keep trying. But what is actually normal when it comes to wanting to have a baby? I mean, if you consider it, normal is you have sex, you get pregnant, you have a baby, you're no longer having this conversation. Any deviation from that means that there are obstacles that we need to understand, right? And often, obstacles that can be overcome. But if we don't understand what they are to begin with, it's that realm of you don't know what you don't know, then you will keep being stuck for a very long time. Sadly, for many of my patients, unnecessarily, but what's even more concerning is that for many, it means that they will run out of time to have a baby altogether.
Mm. Wow. Wow. Okay. Well, I want to sort of take the conversation in two different places. One of them is going to be on the medical side and the scientific side, and then the other one on the social side. I want to take this conversation in those two areas, right? So let me ask you about the medical and the scientific side of it first. So from your research, what are the things that make, let's talk men and then we can go into women, or the other way around, that make it harder to conceive a baby? Is it genetics? Is it diet? Is it habits? Is it age? Or is it a mixture of like that and other things?
It's all of that plus more,
Okay.
right? And certainly, there's a huge focus in medicine about age, and
Mm-hmm.
rightly and wrongly, there is a place to be considering age as a factor, but age is a proxy marker. It basically is like, it's almost like an avatar for other things that are going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens as we age, we start to become less able to replicate cells as effectively as when we were younger. We start to have errors within the DNA. There's different things that essentially start to entropy, starts to kind of take hold of the system, which is that kind of disorder and chaos that can happen. It doesn't happen for all people in the same rate, but for some people, it certainly happens more frequently than others, and or more rapidly than for others. But part of what determines it or triggers it is going to be very linked to habits, behaviors, and lifestyle and environment, right? And environment is all sorts of exposures that we have in our day to day. Sometimes people look at fertility and they think that it's only to do with things that happen on or in your body. But it can also be things to do around your body. Let me give you an example. If somebody smokes, if a female smokes, she will typically enter menopause 5 years earlier than a non-smoking counterpart, right? Which essentially means that you are destroying your fertility by about 5 years by smoking,
Well.
in other words,
Mm-hmm.
right? And for men, the same thing happens. There's definitely destruction of the cells that produce sperm. There's definitely, metabolic dysfunction. There is hormonal imbalance. There's all of those different aspects that are going to break down faster because of certain exposures, toxins, and, other things in our environment. Like I said, in or around us. Passive smoking is going to have that very similar effect. So, and even third hand smoking, which is, when somebody has smoked in a room and it kind of, that settles on furniture and different things, that's also going to have an effect. So even if you weren't there, like in bars, for example, it's a great example of, obviously there is the person smoking, and hopefully, I mean, in Australia, it's no longer allowed to smoke in bars, but I think that around the world, it's still something that happens. But if you consider that kind of context, what happens is that the person smoking obviously will be affected. The people around that person will be affected. But then even if nobody's smoking at the time that you actually enter that place, if people had been smoking there, you will smell it, you will be affected
Mm-hmm.
by those toxins as well. So again, that's about, okay, where do I go? Where do I hang out? Who do I hang out with? How do I hang out? How do I have fun? So all of those things are things that we need to, in a way or another, consider depending on our goals and objectives, right? And that really is what it comes down to. Like, especially when we're younger, we don't consider these risks as such big risks because we think there's a couple of things that we think. One, we think that, it's never going to happen to me. We also think that, I don't have to worry about this right now because I'm young and, it basically doesn't really matter to my situation at this stage. Or we think that, it's really not something that is of interest to me. Those are the types of things that, most people in some way or another will think at the outset of not being in a situation where they want to do something. I remember when I was younger, being at the beach, thinking I don't have to worry about the fact that, skin cancer is a thing until at least another 20 years. So I'm just going to be in the sun right now because the sun right now is pleasing me, right? I'm enjoying this. And I think that a lot of times we almost have to remove that kind of way of thinking um, from our repertoire if we are wanting to optimize fertility in the future, because it's the things that we do right now that can and will have an impact on what goes on. When we then finally decide, what, I actually now want to have a child or complete my family or start my family, whatever it is. So, those are the types of situations that will have an impact. And so, to go back to your question, there are so many different reasons. Sometimes sexually transmitted infections is a really big reason. Think about it. If you're having, a nice time with your girlfriend right today, you're probably not thinking, oh, I want to prevent any kind of sexually transmitted infection because that's going to affect my fertility in the future. But it really does make a huge difference. For example, chlamydia, it will block tubes, whether they are the epididymis, which transports the sperm out of the body, or whether it is, the fallopian tubes, which basically make sure that, the sperm gets to the egg. So those are the types of things that sometimes we don't consider and we don't think about. We did a meta-analysis in my clinic looking at the effect of a lot of, some women experience bacterial vaginosis, which is some type of overgrowth of bacteria in the vagina that causes all sorts of different types of unpleasant symptoms. And, one of the things that ended up happening with that was understanding the effect of bacterial vaginosis associated bacteria, so in women, and how that affected their partners. Because what we saw was that for men whose partner had a lot of bacterial vaginosis associated bacteria, they had poorer sperm parameters. So let's think about it from this perspective. Today, you might be with a woman who is prone to bacterial vaginosis and you have unprotected intercourse. Those bacteria will travel up into the organ, right, the penis, and basically settle somewhere in the prostate and somewhere within the body. Then what happens is that it will lodge there and it will kind of be living there, affecting the quality of the sperm that you now possess. And if you then, 3 partners later decide that you want to have a baby, well, your fertility will be somewhat affected by that experience. Whereas, instead of thinking everything is going to be fine, the pleasure today is going to be worth whatever happens in the future, we might need to think differently in those types of situations and perhaps wear condoms, you know. So those are the types of things that, are kind of important to think about, and that typically, depending on our life circumstances, our level of knowledge, our level of understanding, we may not. Now, if that was you and you had an STI or you used to smoke or whatever else, and now you are in a situation where you want to make changes, there are ways to address those things, right? There are some types of damage that obviously will be permanent. Like we cannot, once a woman has gone into a perimenopausal, menopausal state, and sometimes smoking cigarettes will trigger that faster, right? We can't reverse that. That's not something that's possible. But we can still improve and optimize the quality of the eggs that are still there. When it comes to female fertility, it is different. I often talk to men and talk to couples and men. I had one conversation yesterday with a couple, and this man said to me, I want to be quietly optimistic, or calmly optimistic about this happening, as opposed to being stressed or anxious about it. So I just believe that it's going to happen when it happens, right?
Mm.
And this couple they had been trying for a year. They had experienced 3 miscarriages in that time frame. And I said to him, I said, listen, I totally understand where you're coming from, and that emotional place that you're coming from is great, being quietly optimistic. But the idea or the thought that it's just going to happen when it happens without you actually having to take charge and do things can actually be of detriment to you as a couple, because female fertility is very much finite. It is going to end. There will be a point where women will run out of eggs. The difference between male and female fertility is this: we women are born with all the eggs we'll ever have. When all of these eggs have been ovulated and they have, they are no longer in reserve in the ovaries, then a woman will be kind of deemed to hit menopause. She stops having cycles. Right. The whole
Hmm.
point of menstrual cycles is because there is recruitment of follicles that become eggs. And, then of course we are having a whole process that happens where there is either a pregnancy after ovulation, 2 weeks after ovulation, or there is a shedding of the endometrial lining. And that's what bleeding and a period actually is, right? So either that's going to happen and that's going to continue happening, or we will get to a point where, okay, there's no more egg to trigger that entire process, and a woman will stop having menstrual cycles. Okay. And that will typically happen somewhere between 45 and 55, let's say. Okay. It's a wide range. But the symptoms of perimenopause and the hormonal imbalances that happen with perimenopause can start happening, and typically do, 5 to 10 years before
Mm.
menopause actually happens. So let's say for a woman who is 45 who may hit menopause, her perimenopausal symptoms started happening 10 years before. So, that's at 35, right?
Really young, yeah.
That's really young. And for a woman at 50, it might be 40. So, this is essentially what we need to take into account, is that fertility starts to become less predictable without intervention, right, for women at around the ages of 35 to 45. Okay.
Mhm.
Men, on the other hand, even though we know that the quality of sperm can drastically decrease after age 40, and that quality will be impacted, and it will impact the ability to be able to affect the pregnancy, men will continue to produce sperm all the way until they die. Okay, unless they no longer have testicles, or their testicles andropause, which is the male version of menopause, does happen, but it's much slower and it's much more prolonged.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's going to occur in such a way that it is possible. Wasn't it Hugh Hefner, the Playboy bunny dude,
Mhm. Mhm.
the founder of Playboy?
Yes.
Apparently, he was able to affect the pregnancy in one of his Playboy bunnies at age 90, right? Now, why is that? Because a 20-year-old, so the female egg, is responsible for a very important job when it comes to fertility. It's responsible for doing all of the housework.
Mhm.
Not that I want to gender role this, because men should be doing housework, for all of you listening to this. Um, but let's just put it like this. When it comes to what the egg has to do, part of the egg's responsibility when a sperm enters it, and it's called fertilization, is to fix the errors, the DNA fragmentation within the sperm, so that embryonic development can happen in the best possible way.
Mm.
If an egg is older, right, because the age of the egg is going to be linked to the age of the female. So if the egg is older, it's going to be less pliable, less malleable, and less able to very quickly fix those errors within the mitochondria. Oh, sorry, within the fertilization period, right? It will fix the errors of the DNA fragmentation of the sperm, because its mitochondria are going to be kind of struggling, which is the energy production, battery cells of the egg. They're going to be struggling. So that ability to fix those DNA errors decreases with time. So let's say, for example, if a woman has a partner that is her same age, okay, and they're both, say, 40 or slightly above 40, that sperm is going to be less effective to fertilize that female's egg. That sperm will still be able to fertilize a 20-year-old egg and potentially create a pregnancy at a much faster rate than with a partner the same age.
Mm.
Because what's going to happen is that that egg is going to be better able and have more energy, and biochemically speaking, is going to be better able to fix the DNA fragmentation of the sperm. So that's something that's also important to understand, is that if your partner is your same age, your sperm contribution needs to be way better. And of course, which will absolutely improve and optimize the health of your children with no matter what age egg that sperm is fertilizing, right? Because your contribution to your child's health actually happens at the time of fertilization. But really, the optimization of sperm to make that contribution happens way before a pregnancy is ever in place. So people come to me and they say things like, oh, when I get pregnant, I'm going to eat well, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to be so healthy. Look, that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, what happens is that in order to be able to say that you have the healthiest possible baby, think about it from this perspective. At 8 weeks gestation, which is barely when somebody finds out that they're pregnant in most cases. Some women are very much on the ball. They have a period that's very regular. At 4 weeks, they'll be able to take a pregnancy test and know that they're pregnant, and they'll be able to start taking the kinds of precautions that they need to prevent damage to that embryo, i.e., whatever kind of exposures they typically experience. But you see, by 8 weeks gestation, a baby's health blueprint is set for the rest of its life. By 8 weeks, a baby already has all its little fingerprints, all its little organs, all formed. All that it has to do from that point is grow. So guess what? If the quality of the egg and sperm was subpar at the time of conception, it's not going to improve from there. It's going to hit its kind of potential limit and limitations that were brought into the equation. But if you're preparing for months beforehand, being the best version of yourself and the healthiest version of yourself for months prior to fertilization occurring, well, guess what? You're going to maximize the health potential of that developing embryo simply because you brought better quality and higher quality cells to start the process. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, and the way you've outlined it is so fascinating because it's easy. It's really easy to follow, even for somebody that it's not as bright as myself. Now, I want to ask maybe about some of the environmental factors that also may play a role. So, for example, I know that sperm rates have been progressively decreasing throughout the last, I don't know, it was like 30 or 50 years, maybe more. And I would love to get your take on whether or not that is also affecting and birth rates. And then the question that I want to ask you after that is that it also seems that obviously, especially in more developed countries like the United States, in Europe, and for example, like South Korea and Japan, that the people are having less and less kids. And it almost becomes a very interesting kind of catch-22, right? Because they're having less kids because they want to wait a little longer. But then the fact that they're waiting longer makes it harder for them to actually have the kids in the first place. So it's an interesting sort of situation there. So I want to see if you can sort of talk to both of those things. I know they're not super correlated, but I think there may be maybe something to be said with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the first question, which is environmental impact. Let me make sure that I got this right. Environmental impact on the decline of sperm quantity. Is that right?
Well, that and I mean just the overall fertility, right, for both men and women.
Yeah, for sure. So look, yes, it is true that sperm rate or sperm count has declined substantially. In fact, it has halved in a 50-year period, according to a couple of studies. But the point here is this. Why has that happened? And, if we think about it from the perspective of what are the, excuse me, what are the triggers for this? There is a lot of environmental trigger. There's a lot an environmental trigger. Let's put this in a context, right? It's the exposome. It's all of the things that are related to and that we are surrounded by. It's the environment that we swim in, right? From the foods that we eat to the things that products that we put on our skin to what we wash our hair with to, you name it. Like
Yeah.
literally every single possible thing that could have that could impact your body that surrounds you is around you or it within you is going to have an effect,
Hmm.
right? So, and that's where sometimes people think, oh god, that sounds so extreme. Well, it's because it is.
Hmm.
Right. And if you think about it, and this is just kind of taking it away from the direct example here right now, but this is also part of why this is happening. Our water supplies are extremely polluted, right? There are studies that show in the United States that a cup of unfiltered water holds around almost 1,000 different chemicals
Oh, wow.
from
So
medications,
damn.
literally like a water sample, 1,000 chemicals from Prozac to, medications to the oral contraceptive pill to agricultural and industrial runoff from industry to
Jesus.
plastics to you name it. And this is one of the reasons why, like I'm quite obsessive about this. When I move into any place, I will ensure the first thing that happens is a water filter is installed, a proper,
Mm.
either reverse osmosis or really high quality water filter is installed in my tap so that I'm not drinking water that's unfiltered because I know that those chemicals, even though I'm not trying to get pregnant, for me now, it's all about, I've had my two children and that's that. But, for me, it's really about being the healthiest version of myself
Of
because
course.
we know that it's not just fertility that it impacts. It impacts our body's ability to be at its best. It increases the risk of cancer and all sorts of other diseases if we are
Mm.
being affected by these different types of chemicals, right? And if we are
Hmm. Hmm.
exposed to these different types of chemicals. So when you ask the question of, what are the possible things surrounding us that are causing these issues? Well, it can be pretty much everything, right? And so that's what we need to take into account is that it's not just going to be the choices that we make about the voluntary exposures that we have, i.e., my diet. Of course, that's going to be important. A diet that is high in processed and ultra processed foods is going to negatively impact health on many different kinds of parameters. There are lots of studies that show that it will have a cardiometabolic impact, that it will have a fertility impact, it will have a mental health impact. So, those foods, processed foods and ultra processed foods, of course, are going to make, a big difference in the status of health of the individual. But that is one tiny little tip of the iceberg based on the types of exposures that we can have, even by just drinking water. Right? Now, what is the answer? That you shouldn't drink water? No, actually, that is the wrong answer. And in fact, you should only drink water. You shouldn't be drinking, soft drinks or sweetened beverages or even artificially sweetened beverages or anything. You should be literally just drinking water. But the quality of the water that you drink needs to be assessed, right? And again, when we come back to what is the impact on sperm and sperm quality, all of these factors will play a role, right? I'll give you another example. A lot of times people have, because this is a question when I talk about water, people say, oh, what about bottled water? Well, the problem with bottled water is that it may be filtered, and often it is. Sometimes it's found in the source, which is unfiltered and full of other chemicals, which also could be problematic. Just because it's found in this beautiful, pristine environment doesn't mean that upstream it hasn't been, unfortunately, polluted in some way. The other factor here is that, when people ask about bottled water and if that's okay, well, think about it. It's mostly coming in plastic. right? Plastics, microplastics, phthalates, bisphenols, even when they say BPA free, well, BPA comes in various forms, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you name it. So just because A is not present doesn't mean that every single other one that is still going to impact your health, increase the rate of cancers and all sorts of other things isn't present. And most of the time it is. So it's kind of almost like a trade-off. You're actually making a trade-off around, yes, drinking filtered water, but then having the additional plastic that's going to impact fertility. So it's about thinking in a much broader spectrum, when we're looking to prevent health concerns, particularly when it comes to reproductive health concerns. A lot of these chemicals that I was just talking about that are present in water and bottled water and unfiltered water and so on, they are endocrine disruptors. One thing that most people don't even think about, that plastic wrap that most people put on food to go in the microwave or whatever, that thing is like one of the most toxic things for fertility there ever was. It is a plastic that has these types of chemicals that is highly endocrine disrupting and estrogenic. So when you ask the question about, what happened with sperm parameters and that reduction that has happened in 50 years, well, guess what? Most of it has been done with an estrogenic environment that men now are kind of swimming in the day to day, because a lot of the perfumes that women wear and the nail polishes and lotions and all of these things, they have these endocrine disrupting chemicals. And with perfumes, for example, and men these days also like to wear perfume, also like to wear aftershave, so on, all of those are going to be endocrine disruptors. They're volatile organic compounds at the end of the day. They're chemicals that are going to have that same effect. So a tiny little the dose effect is the thing that we also need to take into account, because what often happens is that the tiniest amount is needed to have the effect that we are discussing in these types of chemicals. So you don't need to be exposed to it, knowingly every single minute of the day for it to actually be having an effect on you. And it's not that I want to make people paranoid here, not at all. The thing about it is this: you've got to do your best on the factors and the things that because for everything that could affect you, there are a multitude of other things that you have absolutely zero control over. Let me explain this, right? Yes, you want to make sure that you are eating organic food and good quality food as best as possible, right, as much as it's accessible. And if you can't access organic food, then the Environmental Working Group has created a fantastic list called the Clean 15, Dirty Dozen and Clean 15. You can Google that and go look for, okay, what are the types of vegetables and fruits that have the highest amount of pesticides that, unless it's organic, you should avoid? And what are the ones that it doesn't really matter if it's not organic? And try and make your selections and your choices based on that. Try and make sure that your food is as fresh and unprocessed as possible. Cooking at home rather than eating out, and really cooking from scratch as best as possible. Avoiding cans and canned products, because all of those typically have a lining inside that is plastic, based, and those are going to have these types of chemicals that we want to avoid. So it's kind of just an awareness exercise, becoming more aware of the places where exposures can occur, and questioning and figuring out, okay, well, how can I reduce these types of exposures? And sometimes it's never going to be about eliminating, because it's impossible to eliminate. After all, we live on planet Earth, right? And if we have a look, our oceans unfortunately are polluted, which means that our food supply is going to be polluted. Our water systems are polluted, which again, it's about reducing as much as we can and being aware of, in the instances where the exposures are solely driven by us, and how else can we be optimizing those, right? That's going to be a really important thing. And there's lots of different areas and places that we can talk about in terms of this that are going to be highly contentious, because sometimes people hate having to adjust their behaviors to be healthier. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have the level of obesity and, other health conditions that are lifestyle based that we have this in the world today. But the truth is that if we aren't at least aware, if we don't have the knowledge, we make decisions by default, decisions that don't necessarily better our health, and certainly that aren't in our best interest. So I think that part of this conversation is about kind of becoming aware of the types of things that you have control over, because there are lots of factors, there are lots of things that you have control over, and not everything is going to be affecting people in the same way too, Raphael. Like, let me put it to you this way. We've all heard of people who have never smoked a day in their life and died of lung cancer, right? And we've also heard of people who were chain smokers and never developed cancer at all. I'll tell you, my dad is one of those people. He never smoked a day in their life, and he's battling cancer and has been for many years. My uncle, who is a chain smoker, never developed lung cancer at all, or any kind of cancer, right? And so you have to question, okay, why is that? Well, differential impact is going to happen because of the way in which our genes respond to exposures, right? So what happens is that some people and some people's genetic predispositions is going to be triggered by the environment. It's called epigenetics. Right. So ultimately, it's we have a saying in genetics that is the environment, the genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. Okay, so you're not necessarily going to be developing a disease just because you have a predisposition. The environmental triggers that you have will switch on or off different genes. And triggers and exposures don't necessarily have to come from out there. We can have triggers and exposures that are self-mediated. If we think about a particular stressful thing and we persist in that thought, well, that's going to trigger some gene to turn on or off, depending on how we choose to even focus our attention. Okay. So it's about just understanding that you can't change everything and you don't need to. And I think that that's really important, right? I think that as much as we can work on being the healthiest version of ourselves on the things that we know and the things that are within our ability to influence, well, that typically is going to make a big difference. Okay. Now, on to the second question, and I hope that makes sense. And if there's anything you want to kind of add or, kind of question in terms of all of that before we move on to the second question, does this all make sense?
No, yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I don't really think I have. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of questions around that, but no, I think the way that you've outlined it is very clear, and I would love to get your take on the second question, because just so that you know, I'm fascinated by all of this, because there's so many moving pieces. So please, I mean, take it away.
Yeah, no, sure. And yeah, and that is true. There are so many moving pieces. And it's interesting because when people come to me, very often they're looking for a simple solution to a very complex problem. Right. And they don't really almost understand at the beginning of the conversation that, often this is one of the funniest things that funny inside myself, because obviously I try to meet each person where they find themselves. But, like when people come to me and they're like, well, can you tell me why I'm not pregnant? It's the second conversation that we're having. Or what is it that you can see that's stopping me? I almost have to kind of like pause and realize that, okay, people really don't know what they don't know, right? And that's reasonable and that's fair, because they think that there is some kind of very simple answer to such a complex lot of mechanisms that are actually creating the issue that they're experiencing. I often like to talk about the fact that, whatever it is that people experience, whether it's inability to conceive, inability to keep a pregnancy to term, failed IVF treatments, whatever it is. These are outcomes. These are end results of many biochemical chain reactions that start literally all the way on the other side of the spectrum of what it is that they are experiencing, right? And so what that means is that because of these epigenetic, switching on and off of different genes and, all of those types of things, people are not, the same intervention is not going to apply for the same diagnoses. Let me explain this. I can have 10 men be lined up with low sperm motility, like the sperm doesn't swim as well as it should, right? Low motility, 10 different men. There can be 10 different reasons as to why it's happening for every single one of them. Okay. And so that's the thing that we expect, because I think medicine these days has trained us to have a disease and a drug for, treatment for that solution, right? So if there's a problem, this is the solution. Well, with fertility, it's not quite that simple. There isn't infertility and this is the solution, because if it was, guess what? IVF wouldn't fail 70% of the time. Now, imagine this. Imagine a treatment that is so ineffective that it fails 70% of the time, but it's considered gold standard. Right? So you kind of go, I scratch my head around that even to this day, because what about, what could it look like if we actually started to personalize this entire conversation? And imagine for a moment what it would be like if we started to understand why infertility is happening in the first place before trying to apply some kind of general intervention to it. Right? Okay. What a world we would be in. I mean, imagine if you actually diagnose the problem before trying to fix it. Like, it seems so novel. It seems so unthinkable. But unfortunately, that's not what happens when it comes to infertility. Like literally what happens is that a couple will go to their GP. They will be told, you haven't conceived in 3 months? Well, now it's time for IVF. And they will go into IVF and the IVF cycle will fail. And then they will be told, you know what? Don't worry, just keep trying. It's a numbers game. I'm like, okay, but why is it that didn't work? Oh, no, we don't know. Just keep trying. Okay, but why do I need it to begin with? Look, that's not important. We can bypass all of the, reasons for infertility with just doing this treatment. Well, can you? Why is it that I have to do, on average, 8 cycles to get close to an 80% live birth rate? I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd to me. Yet, that is how the healthcare system operates. Yet, that's what's expected and deemed okay and normal and acceptable. Right. And I just go, oh my Lord.
Well, I mean, I guess that's also a broader conversation on the healthcare system in its entirety, right? And a lot of the I guess it's I don't I don't want to say that it's a failure of the people, but I mean it could be one of the failures of such a systematic approach, right? And to try to scale it from that perspective, they
Well,
haven't seen
you,
the individual, right?
well, they certainly haven't. But, would it be deemed a failure? Absolutely not. From a business perspective, it's genius,
Right,
because
exactly.
IVF is a multi-billion-dollar industry, right?
Yeah,
So what happens is that, well, it's working pretty well. It's creating and generating a whole lot of money that, wouldn't be in the system otherwise, if it wasn't for the fact that desperate couples are actually the targets almost of something that is so inefficient and ineffective,
right,
right? So I
right.
think that part of this is that, every system is specifically designed to deliver the result that it delivers. And
Hmm.
that is a systems process in the healthcare system. That's essentially how we see it.
Right.
Excuse me. But the fact is that IVF is not engineered to deliver the best possible outcome when it comes to babies. It's engineered to deliver the best possible number of cycles that still will be acceptable to be paid for by the end user, right? Which it might sound like a skeptical way of looking at the actual system, but I've been in it now for so many years that that is an absolute criticism that I have about this industry, right? I think that so many couples, especially the couples that I treat, because like I said, I'm not treating the beginning of the line kind of people. I'm treating the end of the line, type of people who basically typically have tried everything and nothing has worked. Therefore, what I'm looking at is not going to be about just keep doing IVF cycles until it works after the 20th. Like I've had patients that have had 20 or 30 failed IVF cycles, and the doctor still is happy to take their money at $15,000 a pop, right? To continue doing cycles. Now imagine 20 cycles, 20 failed IVF cycles at $15,000. That is more than the price of a house. Who can afford that? Right? Who can afford that? And yet, people are not educated to be able to understand that there is more they can do. And that's my issue, is that, sure, let's have that as a process and a procedure that couples have access to after they've optimized every other potential aspect and area of their health and their being to have the best possible outcome through treatment, right? So
Yeah.
I think that that's really something that, really bugs me in a big way.
Yeah, no, and I mean, honestly, I think for any other business, right? If you were, I mean, there's, I mean, the ethical component of it. If you had a business and you keep selling a product that doesn't work 8 times, you should really start to ask yourself if this is a good product, right? And should you be investing money into this? I think that with the way that society is changing as well. So it may not be as easy for a lot of young men and women to have children at an earlier age, right? And I think that the way in which our society is structured now, that both genders have to work, both people have to um, wait a lot longer to be more financially stable. So,
Mm.
in older generations, people could afford a home at a much younger age. It wasn't costing them $500,000, $1 million to buy a single family home. And so I think all of those components could be considered in there as well, right?
Well, look, absolutely. And I think that, part of this whole conversation, there's a whole cost of living of conversation that is huge when it comes to this. One of the and it's so difficult because sometimes people come to me and they say, oh, we don't want to invest in fertility treatment, or we don't have that kind of money to spend. And I almost question, because I mean, if you think about it, right, there are those cases where people are spending ridiculous amounts of money on IVF cycle after IVF cycle. It doesn't have to be that way, right? It's certainly through our clinic, that is not the way at all. Like, we notice that what we're able to deliver a baby at an infinitely, kind of lesser cost. And an improvement of health. So, from that perspective, there's definitely other benefits, and there are other advantages and other options out there. I think that the biggest thing here is that couples don't actually get told about them. They have to almost find them because they're outside. They're almost kind of like at the fringe of the healthcare system, you know. And so basically it's not, and this is part of why I'm doing my doctorate at Harvard, because in terms of public health, I know that what we do delivers an infinitely better outcome, but it needs to be structured within and a restructuring of the healthcare system, right? So it's a big conversation, because healthcare system structuring in itself is an infinite job, so to speak, right? So that's one thing. But the other factor, and this is something also that I often hear from people, is that yes, fertility treatment can be expensive and that they can't necessarily afford it. But if we put this in context, a child is not free, right? Having a child, and I don't need to tell you this, Raphael, but having a child is not a cheap exercise, full stop, right? In the first, I mean, I think it would be reasonable to say that the average couple would be spending, you know, by the time in the first year of that child's life, anywhere between, I would say, 20 to 100,000, and probably more, $50 to $100,000. By the time you set up, by the time you deliver the baby, by the time you set up, the environment for the baby, by the time you've had, all the things that essentially are going to be necessary or needed for that child, wouldn't it be, am I kind of really off? Would it be around the $20,000 to $100,000 for the first year of a baby's life?
100%, 100%. And I think
Right?
maybe I mean, if you want to count in the psychological cost of it, but definitely on the monetary
An
side, yeah,
opportunity,
at least
an opportunity
$20,000.
cost. Yeah, right. So
Yeah,
an
yeah.
opportunity cost because you can't work. Like a woman is not going to go back straight to work. So, like
Right.
let's count opportunity cost in that, which is, the woman not being able to go back to work straight away because she's breastfeeding a child, taking care of a child, whatever it is. Let's just name that just to be conservative. Let's just put it at 50 grand, right? $50,000. Now, it won't cost you through fertility treatment typically, if you do it as effectively as is possible to do it, it won't cost you $50,000. But when people say, oh, I can't afford to do fertility treatment, then tell me where you're going to get that $50,000 for the first year of that child's life before you actually, get it. I.e., the year before having a child, which is the year that you would be kind of going through fertility treatment and spending that first year of a child's life on that child just before it's born, right? And then you actually get onto the first year. And from there, the expenses do not decrease. And I think that this is really the important point for a lot of people to understand is that the expenses just increase. Right? They do not go down. The cheapest time in a child's life is going to be literally the first year where mostly it's being breastfed. And even if it's being given baby formula, well, guess what? That's pretty cheap in comparison with the school uniforms and the school materials and the food and the this and the entertainment and so I don't need to kind of go into that because, most people kind of understand what it is that I'm talking about. Most people, even just affording themselves, find it hard to, have shelter and food and, all of the things that essentially are necessary in order to be able to just live a quality life. But those are the factors as well that I think people need to take into account, and part of the fertility challenge that you're describing, which is people leaving it to later, people not having as many children, people decrease fertility overall decreasing in the world, is to do with these factors. Is to do with the fact that it's very expensive to have children, and there are many people out there today that have decided that children is not going to be a part of their life because they want to live a different kind of lifestyle. My sister is one of those people. She basically decided, well, no, I'm not going to have children because I want to live a different life. I want to be able to spend that money on myself and not on my child, which, hey, no judgment, right? Whatever it is that people basically decide that they want to do and that they're going to do is fine. But also a reason why people are delaying having babies because they feel like they want to be more financially structured and they want to invest in their careers first. And that's really valid, right? For me, that was definitely something that I did. I had my first child at 33, my second child at 36, and I had been working for, over a decade at that point, 12, 13 years, because I wanted to make sure that I had an established career, that when I actually had a child, I would have already had achieved some of the things that I wanted to achieve in my career, right? So I think that that's valid too. Except these days, what's happening, a lot of women are leaving it to, instead of 33 and 36, 43 and 46. And unfortunately, the female biological, time frame for a fertility window, it doesn't yet expand that far. And this is why many companies are providing benefits such as freezing eggs and, so that they can keep their workers working for longer before they actually go and have children, which is all well and good. But here's the thing, and this is something that I think people need to know. Egg freezing is still very, very early in its technology development. And when I say early, it's been around for about 30 or 40 years, but that's really in the context of, the fact that we've been living for millions of years is very early. And what we also know is that just because an egg was frozen and, kind of put in storage, it doesn't mean that it's going to thaw well and be able to be fertilized or that's actually going to become an embryo. or that it's going to actually develop into a positive pregnancy or a baby. Frozen eggs don't necessarily translate into a baby. Okay. So even though it might be an insurance policy, quote unquote, that some people might want to use, it doesn't mean that it's going to be successful every single time that it's done.
Yeah. Oh man. And let's sort of wrap up with this question. What do you think are because I think there's so many topics. I don't even think we got through half of them. Which is a good thing, right? Because it's a very deep topic. Um,
Oh.
but let's see if we can sort of wrap up with this question. What are the negative implications in society as a whole for having children at a later age and for having less children? You think, or are there no negative implications, or maybe some positive ones as well?
Yeah. Look, I think that there are pros and cons,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you think about it, as people are older and more established, children, they will come into homes that are more stable. They will come into parents that are more mature. Like if I think about it, and if we all think about it, we all we think that we were growing up when we were children. Actually, we were seeing our parents grow up too.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Oh yeah.
like my mom had me when she was 21. She had been married for 3 years, but the reality of it is that she was 21.
Yeah. Same here.
Right? Think of yourself at 21. Like I look at myself at 21. And I'm like, gosh, I would have been so ill-equipped
Mm-hmm.
to have a baby. Not because, and I was the most responsible 21-year-old you've ever known, right? But I don't think that psychologically I would have been ready or prepared or able to be able to really, be the kind of mother to my children that I am today, right? Be the moderate and temperate and thoughtful kind of human that I am today. Like, because you need to be that to be
Yeah.
able to have children. You have to, and they test you. Oh my God, they test you, right? So
Oh yeah.
like, there are days you just want to squeeze their neck,
Oh
and you
yeah.
kind of like breathing, pulsing, going, oh my God, is this child going to, like snap out of it at some point?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, at some point, but it's not going to be some point in the next 20 years, right? So you have to be able to contain yourself through all of that. So I think that there are benefits of having children at a later age. There are also drawbacks. Obviously, you know, your children, the older you are, the more likely or less likely they are to be able to spend time with you at your peak level of health.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And to be able to enjoy different things that if you're younger, you'd be able to enjoy with your children and vice versa. So, in terms of like population and population level, as a fertility specialist, this is a really interesting conversation. It's kind of like I don't see only drawbacks and I don't see only benefits,
Right.
right? We know that like, if we look at the planet's population, it's increasing. Therefore, is fertility really a problem? Well, fertility or infertility is only a problem for the person having it, really.
Mm.
That's the reality,
Yeah.
right? Because in the scheme of things, we are not having a world population decline.
No.
Humans are not actually decreasing amongst us. They are increasing to the point that, there's a lot of concern out there whether the planet can withstand and hold the expected number of people that we're going to have in years to come. So, like I'm one of those people. I probably am not the right person to answer that question in terms of like, what it looks like on a planetary level. Um, Even though I do see benefits and drawbacks, I think that as humans, as a species, we're going to have to become so much more resourceful to be able to feed. It's because it's not the fact that we can't even now feed the number of people that we have or house them or, give quality life for all of the humans on Earth. It's that we are using a system that is ineffective on
Mm-hmm.
many
Yeah.
levels, right? The systems that we are using are outdated and we haven't got better ideas at this point. I think that we are capable of being even more resourceful, of being better able to, organize and do things differently. But I don't like right now. Imagine if the population of the world doubled,
Mm-hmm.
we would be in a lot of trouble. If we keep the current systems,
Mm-hmm.
right,
Mm-hmm.
we would be in a lot of trouble if that happened, say, in a year. Therefore, we then need to think about, okay, well, what are the new systems? What are the new ideas? What are the new conversations that we need to be having if we are to expand in different ways, right? What
That's
is
right.
the, what are the things that are going to break that we need to fix preemptively? What are so there's a lot of those conversations that I think as humans we need to have. But when it comes to fertility, there's definitely a lot that is within people's control, right? And there's a lot of choice, values, preferences. Sometimes people want things in a certain way, and, they're not going to be able to get it in that particular way, but they can get it in a different way. And I talk about this in terms of the options that are available for people, even through fertility treatment, right? There are lots of different options that are available these days that weren't available 20 years ago or 40 years ago.
Right.
So I think that there is benefit overall in a net value way. I think that we are certainly improving. I think that there are definitely things that we can be doing better. But I think that the progression of evolution of, how things occur and how things are available to us as humans these days, certainly, is, I think there is more benefit to drawback. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And like I think it's more of a scalability issue, right? And I think that the response that you get a lot from a lot of individuals that are afraid, let's say, of overpopulation is their response is we'll need to have less humans, right? We need to control
That's
human
right. Which is
reproduction,
like
which
so
you can't really
ineffective.
do. Yeah, it's ineffective because, well, even if you could control it in, let's say, the state that you're in, right? So, like, let's say a Western country, that doesn't mean that you can control it in different
In
places,
India
or like,
or in
that's
China
right.
or like and so here's the thing, and I agree with you completely. I think that we have to think about this from a different perspective, and
Yeah,
hopefully some of the listeners here today are going to be able to be the idea bearers for
right.
these new conversations that really are needed, in terms of our world,
Yeah,
because I think that as a species, we are incredibly resourceful and capable. I think that we don't utilize our abilities in the best possible way
I agree with you.
many,
I agree with
many
you.
times.
And I've never seen anybody approach that problem from that perspective, right? So is it the fact that we're having too many kids, or is it the fact that our systems are not scalable? At least at that point, right? And I think we could find, especially with AI, I think that would be maybe some of the positive applications of the technology, where it's like, how do we scale our production? How do we do it in a way that is healthier than what we're currently
Sustainable.
doing and sustainable?
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely, absolutely, and good for the planet. I think that we do have to take planetary health into this conversation because, a lot of the reasons as to why, on an individual level, we are negatively affected is because of exactly what I described before.
Yeah.
If our oceans are polluted, our food supply is going to be polluted. If that's polluted, we are going to be, and then our health is going to decline. So if we're just, creating and amassing more and more junk
Yeah.
that goes into landfill, well, guess what? Eventually, we're going to have a situation where that's going to be polluting all of our water supplies,
Yeah.
all of our food,
Yeah.
all of our, so we can't be healthy if we don't take care of our environment.
Correct.
And
Correct.
that is a really key takeaway from this conversation. It's like we don't exist in isolation. We don't exist in a vacuum. Being as healthy and as fertile as possible doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It
Exactly.
happens within a context, within an environment. And I think that the more we take care of our environment, the more we take care of our own health.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
And this is the ironic part, right? Because even if we somehow magically manage to reverse the population increase, that doesn't change the fact that the reason why we're having the problems that we're having is because the system is so mismanaged, because we're polluting the environment so much. So really, the problem doesn't really come down to the amount of people that we have. The problem comes down to the way that we're managing the production of
Exactly.
of 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 our goods and services. So I think that's a better place to look for the solution, right? But again, going back
Absolutely.
to some of the points that you mentioned on the medical industry, it seems like we're trying to find a medication for the symptom, but we're not actually trying to solve the fundamental problem, right?
Exactly, exactly. So the root cause of all of this is completely overlooked,
Yeah,
right? Which is obviously an ineffective way to manage any problem
right.
because you're going to be blindsided. You get the first solution, you're going to be blindsided by that when it deviates from what, is expected. And that really is, again, where I repeat, it's one of my favorite quotes: every system is designed to deliver the result that it delivers. And,
That's right.
if
Yeah,
we have to be a little bit skeptical about a system that delivers $1 billion of profits to shareholders and
that's
investors,
right.
and what does that really mean for the end user,
Correct.
right? And is the end user really the one that's being prioritized here, or are the shareholders the ones that are really being prioritized?
Yeah.
That's such an important question that I think that people think that, oh, you say this because you don't, whatever, like, you do IVF or whatever. It's like, no, that's not why. The reason why is that I think people need to be thinking about very critically what they're choosing and why it's being provided to them in the way that it is.
Yeah.
It's not even about the fact that it's being provided. I think it's a wonderful, miraculous technology that, used in the appropriate way, is amazing, but it's not being used in an appropriate way. It's actually being misused and overused,
Yeah.
systematically overused and misused, because essentially it drives profits.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, and this is the other thing that I think is really fascinating about the conversation, because um that perspective, which is, I mean, it's a perspective that's very down to earth. It's very much grounded in fact, right? Which based on everything you mentioned. But when you start talking about the influence of business inside of government, and the fact that the
And
government is
health.
also prioritizing profits over the health of people and their protection, and you have this really strange sort of it's almost hard to describe what this system is, right? Because it's almost like it's like a system that is authoritarian in some ways, but not necessarily, where there's like corporate and governmental interests are kind of like intertwined very
Look, I
interestingly.
mean, see, the thing about this, there is no better example than the tobacco industry. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We know smoking kills. We
Yes.
know
Yeah.
it has been proven, it has been like validated. Like, we know this so well. Like, we're using tactics like, putting images of sick people on smoking, boxes and on cigarette boxes and all of these things. But why is it that we know very clearly that cigarettes will kill you, and yet they're still legally sold? Do
Right.
you know the amount of profits and taxes that governments collect? How much of an industry it is to be
Oh
able
yeah.
to actually have that as a way to kill people, so that you can then have a healthcare system that heals
Right.
people, and
Right.
then you can have. So, I'm sorry, this is not a conspiracy theory by any means. I'm certainly not that kind of person, but I think that we have to question very critically, why is it that things like that are still happening in the 21st century?
Yeah. Well, I think the reason why you're able to see it, and I think the reason why other people that are in business are able to see it, is because you're looking at it from a business perspective, and then you understand, right? It's like, well, they're providing they're giving you the illness, but they're also giving you the cure. So from a business standpoint, it's a great business. I mean, it
It,
is a
Absolutely,
magnificent
it's
business
vertically
model.
integrated.
It is.
It's
It is.
very deeply,
Yeah.
very deeply. Well, thank you so much, Raphael, for having this conversation. I think that it's such an important one for people to really, get clarity around, and open their eyes and question a little bit more, what
Hmm.
it is that they're getting themselves into.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've taken away from everything that we said is that even though we're creatures that were gifted with the gift of foresight, it's something we practice very little. And hopefully somebody that's been listening to this can really take that and say, okay, I need to start sacrificing my hedonistic desires right now, because of the future of not just myself, but my future children and their children and all of the generations to follow. So, Gabriela, I want to thank you again very much for your time and sharing this knowledge with us. Just really quickly, where can people find you?
They can Google me. So it's Gabriela, Gabriela Rosa, Gabriela Rosa, or they can go to my website, which is fertilitybreakthrough.com. Those are the places where they're going to find me.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.